Are we rolling?
We're good.
Okay.
So maybe I'll move to this side.
Okay. Well, you're all alone over there. Okay, well, just by way of introduction, you've met everybody. Earl is our former owner and publisher of this newspaper, and Fern and Liz are community members. Mike, you know, and I'm the editor. So.
And Eli I've met.
Yes.
And Eli, sorry, Eli.
I checked out his pedigree a little bit.
Sorry about that. Okay, well, that's good.
And you've met our people in the room here.
Yes.
And Tommy Binion and
Yeah.
so.
Yes, very good. Thank you. So, first of all, let me welcome you. Thank you for coming.
On time?
He was even early.
I
He was early.
You started this meeting to the second, I might point out.
Oh. Well, that's got to be a first. But anyway, welcome. We're really glad you could take the time to come and visit with us. This is kind of an informal discussion. People will just jump in when they have questions. And so let's get started, and I will ask you an easy one, I hope, to start with, and that is, you've been a congressman for a while. You have a new district. Tell us why you're running again, why you want to be reelected, and what your goals are when you go to Washington.
Well, like any of us that have served in the legislative arena, we don't always get what we want. And if we do, we don't get it as soon as we would like. There are many items out there on the agenda that I've worked on for some time, and there's been times we've lost some ground. And so I'd start with first, the agenda that I've laid out in this campaign really does say why I'm running for re-election. And you'll recognize me as one of the top one or two opponents to Obamacare. I brought the first draft to repeal it before the sun came up on the night that it passed. And I've worked to undo that ever since, because there are many things I think we need to do with health care that we can't do with Obamacare in the way. That's item number one. Second one is debt and deficit. And I've watched it grow, and I've stood in the way of it over and over again, but it has been driven in such a way that I've seen that debt and deficit grow from some number around $6 trillion up to around $16 trillion. And I would point out that in the last 6 years, it's been $7 1/3 trillion that has been added to our debt. My votes and my voice have pushed against that hard, and we need more support like that in Congress. So those are the two big things. I'd say that you will hear my colleagues talk about a fiscal cliff, and even though that metaphor does fit, I would say it's more a fiscal waterfall, in that we're coasting along here in this inflated pontoon of America's economy, and every once in a while we put a paddle out in the water and steer it a little, but we're coasting. And so I'm starting to hear, and have been for several years, hearing that funny noise in my ears that's turning out to be the roar of the waterfall. And I'm afraid that we don't have very much longer to paddle ourselves back away from that waterfall and get away from going off the waterfall into that abyss of financial insolvency and becoming one huge grease. Those are the two biggest things. Now, if we can succeed in that and get a balanced budget amendment passed out of the Congress and sent to the states for ratification, I think the states will ratify it. And I don't think it'll take that long to get that done, but it's still years. We do those two things, it makes many other things possible. And if we fall short in that, it's going to be, to quote Secretary Rumsfeld, a long, hard slog for us. So those are the two biggest reasons. I have many other reasons behind that, but those are predicates to make progress in many other pieces.
Okay. Before we get into some more specifics, as you have been campaigning in your new district, what do you think are the chief concerns of your constituents in the 4th District?
I want to qualify this in this way. It's my belief that the public's chief concerns will be the things they see in the news. So to a certain extent, the national news drives the things that they think and talk about. The local news drives the things they think and talk about. But the chief concern, regardless, is going to be jobs in the economy. And it's interesting to me that both sides talk about jobs in the economy. one of the things that neither side talks about very much is that we need private sector growth. And if we're going to have private sector growth, there has to be the potential for profit in the private sector. And when that profit comes, becomes prosperity, and prosperity is, and the prospects of being able to get a better return on the investment is what creates the jobs. So we're stopping short of the real reason. We just don't say it, or maybe we assume everybody knows, but there has to be a prospect for profit and profitability, and that is, I think, the most important thing on the minds of the public. They've got to, and that means we have to have low and stable tax rates, and we need to have less regulation than we have today.
Okay. You mentioned that if you were able to accomplish balanced budget, debt, and deficit control, that it would allow the government to do other things. What are those other things that you would want the government to be doing if it didn't have to pay all this interest and whatnot?
Well, that is a long ways down the road, and it'd be nice to have the flexibility to talk about that now. But really in front of us is this challenge, the challenge of bringing in $2.6 trillion and spending $3.6 trillion, or close to that number. And unless we get that under control, there's no merit to us talking about what we can do to expand government. We need to talk about the government that we can better fine-tune. And even among the entitlements, even among the discretionary spending, there's not enough room in discretionary spending to get us where we need to go. The entitlements have to be addressed. They need to be addressed downstream, not in the short term, so that people 55 and up are not faced with having to alter the plans that they've made for their lives. And if they plan their lives around eligibility for Medicare and Social Security as part, or all even, in too many cases all, that's got to stay the same, but we've got to look downstream and get that done. So those things to address the entitlement. There's another piece of this that doesn't get talked about very much, and that's growth. And we're right now in such a stagnant, if you can call it a growth pattern technically, but 1% growth is not going to get us where we need to go. If we can get that growth going, and it's not going to come unless we have low predictable taxes and less threat of increasing regulation and maybe even the prospect of reducing regulation. If we can get to those points where I'd like to go, we can see this growth, and the growth will surprise us perhaps on how we come out of this. If you remember, just hit the cycles that we are in, and I guess I got to live through some of this, so I remember it, but bypassing those ugly years of the farm crisis of the 80s and getting our way on up into the 90s. But we had a dot-com bubble that was created in the 90s, and we had this booming economy. And my opinion on it is that capital invested in our ability to be able to store and transfer information far more efficiently than ever before, and far more efficiently than imagined not that many years before. As that capital was invested into the dot-com businesses, the capital expected that, well, if you have a dot-com business here, it's going to be profitable, because here we are in this whole new information age that has now taken us from the Industrial Revolution into the information revolution. And that bubble grew out of the anticipation that that would be turned into profit. But what they forgot was that for that to be profit, it had to provide a means for us to be more efficient, or means for us to be better able to market these products. It wasn't that. There's only two things. You could, out of information that makes us more efficient, more productive, more competitive, or you could sell it off for recreational people that would buy it to surf the internet, for example. So the dot-com bubble was a false bubble in our economy. That burst, and that bubble was lanced by the lawsuit against Microsoft, and I believe it would have burst anyway, but that was the moment in history when it did. I think then that Alan Greenspan recognized that there was a hole in our economy, and he set about creating the real estate bubble that was to fill the hole created by the dot-com bubble. But during that period of time, we had this dynamic growth in the economy in the mid-90s, and the revenue came in faster than Congress anticipated, and that was one of the reasons we got to balance. Another was there was discipline in Congress in that day, and there was a certain tension between Bill Clinton and the majorities in the House and in the Senate. But the Congress itself didn't solve this. Part of it was growth, the growth that came, and some of it was the growth from the dot-com bubble that burst about that period of time, and some of it then we've seen the results of the real estate bubble that, as we're still paying a price for now.
There were higher tax rates in the 90s, however. And that would seem to raise a question about whether there's a cause and effect between lowering taxes and increased growth. How do you explain that higher taxes in the 90s and also higher growth and balanced budget?
Well, I think I did. I think it was more of a speculator's market in the 90s. The dot-com bubble that grew during the 90s. That was part of it. Then, as a means of coming out of that, then Greenspan's unnaturally low interest rates that created a housing bubble that added another boost to this. So there's two pieces to that. And there's a lot of other factors involved, but what we're dealing with right now is a depressed outlook on our economy, the lack of optimism with capital that's frozen. Our marketplaces are not investing it, it's not creating jobs, the economy's stuck, and we're watching now as millions of people decide not to look for a job anymore too. So that's a way to explain it, but there's another way, and that is if someone has, say they've invested $10 million in capital and created a good number of jobs, and if you would say to them, okay, your 35% corporate tax rate is now going to be 45, do they invest any money again, or do they consolidate their assets and try to take money out of the company? And if 45% doesn't do it, does 55, 65, 95, at what point do they say, I'm not in this just so that somebody has a job, I'm going to have some return on my investment. So where is that line? We think that, well, Mitt Romney's statement is that if about 20% out of our GDP can go to the federal government. I'd say a little less than that. We've had that discussion, he and I. But there's a place where there's a diminishing return, and when you starve the goose that lays the golden egg, you stop getting those golden eggs. You don't notice it right away.
I guess to follow up on that, Congressman, the growth did happen. I mean, it may have been a sugar high, as I think looking back on the dot-com bubble probably was, but the growth did happen at a time when those tax rates, the marginal rate was higher. So I think that's the quandary that, as most Republicans like yourself suppose, the only way that you can have growth is through lower taxes. But that was a time where we had growth and higher taxes.
But is there a belief out there that there was a cause and effect that higher taxes brought about growth?
No, I don't think there's that. I think the belief is that despite having higher taxes, it didn't stop growth.
Yeah. And I would recognize that. I think that you can clearly see that in the data that's there. And whether there had been a lot more growth if the taxes have been lower at that period of time, I don't know that, because I don't think that economy was real. What did we create out of that? A lot of money made and lost, and then the inflation factor that's in, and we've injected a lot of currency out into this marketplace. The dollar buys less. Energy prices have gone to the top and broke, and then come back up to the top again in that period of time too. Energy is a tax on everything you do. You add labor prices have gone up substantially. So, and the costs of the components of this business cycle are multiple. And because we know that there's no simple cause and effect, but we're talking about the tax rate as how it affects the complicated picture of the economy. And generally, I will say that the economy is significantly more likely to grow if taxes are low and predictable. But business will adjust to the predictable before they'll adjust to the low and unpredictable. I mean, this is a message I get from business, is that if you say to them, we're going to give you a lower tax rate part of the time, but you're always going to have to live with the anxiety, we might raise it up 10 or 20% on you, or tax your capital gains, then business would say, why don't you just leave taxes a little higher and leave me alone? That's the predictability part is more important than most of us are emphasizing, in my opinion. And I started a business in '75, and I was whipsawed by a lot of changing of the rules, and it drove me crazy.
You're known as having a fairly provocative personality, which I think your supporters really like, because they'll always say, well, we know how Steve King feels about this, and I think actually your detractors probably like it too, because it's good sound bites. So I'd like to ask you a question, not about you looking ahead, but maybe you having been there for a while and looking back. I'm also going to qualify this by saying I know with the news media, anyone can take anything out of context, you know, from both sides, you know, there's a lot of splaining to do all the time, Lucy, with this. Are there either things that you regret or things that you, a policy that you voted on that you would not do now, that you think are mistakes? Because you're very clear in saying, this is what I believe, and, you know, fairly consistent in repeating it. So are there things that you wouldn't do?
That is a very provocative question.
You think?
Oh, yeah.
That's why we got her.
I think it is. But I'm happy to engage in things. First of
Okay.
all, if I change my mind on anything,
Yeah.
it would be foolish of me to say so with this close to an election. Straight answer. And I think often of Margaret Thatcher when she came to Buena Vista College back in May of '94, and a student asked her, she said, Justice Blackmun has changed his position on the death penalty since he left the bench. What have you changed your position on since you left office? And Lady Thatcher stood there and she said, goodness, I was in office for 11 and a half years. My positions were very solidly based. I saw no reason to change them. And that sticks in my head because I respected her answer. I won't say I haven't made mistakes in the last 10 years, but I don't want to...
But you're not going to say...
Well, and they haven't been large enough to go back and do a mea culpa on either. So generally, no, that's been consistent. And if I look back on statements made, there's never been an apology issued out of my office. I should say this, I have never issued an apology. That's a more accurate way to put that. The facts that we've put out, I know that there's been a constant scrutiny that living in this fishbowl. I can't think of the times, but I think there have been a couple of times that I issued a statement to correct data that went out in a press release, but I don't remember it being pointed out by anybody else. We have really worked hard, and it doesn't mean we're perfect, and maybe there's something out there that I don't remember, but it's been our focus to keep it factual. And even when some of the data was provocative, I put provocative data out there because I want people to think. I want them to think about the real relationships that go on between the different data that's out there. And there's a number of them that come to mind. And also, I'm very well aware that when I first arrived in Congress, you're the lowest on the totem pole. There are 434 of them. Well, not technically, but along up the line. You're going to break out of that pack. You have to do something a little bit different. And you better make sure it's factual and accurate. You have to be building the mutual respect from your peers, and that requires it to be factual and accurate, and that it be philosophically sound and driven by those things. But to cause people to stop and think, I think that's something that I have done, and I've done it more in the earlier years than I do most recently because I don't need that kind of traction anymore. I've built the kind of relationship with my colleagues and peers, and that it doesn't require that as much. And I think you'll notice that it would be diminished over the years.
Okay, just one more little push into provocative. How do you say that word?
You said it well.
Okay, so one thing is like a statement, you know, like saying, you know, if Barack Obama were president, terrorists would be dancing in the street, which was a very provocative statement, and I personally think an unfortunate one. But then the other thing is policy issues that you were voting on. So something like voting for the Iraq War. That wasn't the.
But I didn't vote for that.
You didn't. Oh, you didn't vote for that.
No, that decision was made before I got there, and it was the
supported it.
authorization
Yeah,
for use of military force that was passed by Congress, the previous Congress before I arrived, in the aftermath of September 11th. I did support them, and
You know, and you know, to your credit, a lot of people did, and feel now wrongly. But
well, I want to tell you a profound thing that I came to with that. I've made 9 trips over into the war zone between Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've gone into the ER at Baghdad and at Balad. I look these warriors in the eye, and I see a noble look in their eye, and they've sacrificed a great deal.
yes,
And I can remember sitting in a hotel, and it was June 11th, 2004, in Kuwait City, waiting to go into Iraq the next day, and I was watching Al Jazeera TV, and on that TV came Muqtada al-Sadr, whom you remember, the Mahdi militia commander, and with his big old burly beard and needing a dentist, and he was, I was emphatically stating into the camera, presumably in Arabic, and I'm reading the English closed caption underneath. He said, if we continue attacking Americans, they will leave Iraq the same way they left Vietnam, the same way they left Lebanon, the same way they left Mogadishu. And I've known about that and thought about it and how it works for what inspires our enemies. If they think we've lost our will, that's what happened in Vietnam. General Giap, who was considered as the general who put together the strategy that he says defeated the United States in Vietnam, said he got his first inspiration on how to defeat the United States because we were willing to accept a negotiated settlement in Korea. And so when I hear Muqtada al-Sadr and I link that together with General Giap's philosophy, and I think about our enemies that are sitting there and they're listening to messages that come from the United States, and they're deciding, they're making bombs or making IEDs or deciding whether, how and where they're going to attack Americans. If we encourage the enemy is encouraged to kill Americans. And I came to this position that more Americans were dying in places like Iraq, and I was seeing some of them, the remnants of what came back from them, because the enemy was being encouraged. However much it was willful, I don't think so. But I don't think they understood that when they're sitting in a hut in Afghanistan or Iraq and they're watching Al Jazeera TV, and they do, and satellite dishes are all over Iraq, and they were about the time we arrived there. I asked the question, does he make more bombs or less? Does he detonate more bombs or less? And this moved me considerably to defend our troops and their mission.
Yeah, but I think my question was about the wisdom of getting in the first place in places like Vietnam and Iraq, and that is something that you don't regret.
Well, that wasn't my call.
Okay.
And so is what I'm.
Well, regret for our country then.
Well, it's hard to go back and unravel history, and sometimes in position where I'm in, if I unravel history, it undermines the future in some way. So I want to just make this point that when our troops are ordered into battle by our commander-in-chief, whoever it is, and you didn't hear me come out and be extremely critical of the president when he ordered us into operations in Libya. I said he's a commander-in-chief. He has to have the authority to do that. We've got to defend our troops and their mission, because to undermine their mission costs American lives. That's really my point.
If I could follow up on that, I mean, it seems like the only way to prevent the enemy from thinking that we're weak or that we'll capitulate would be to stay there forever.
Or defeat them.
How do we defeat that? I guess, how do we take over the country? I mean, I guess I don't know what that means.
There's been so much that has been paid for in blood and treasure in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade, and so much of that seems to have been lost in the last few years. I don't know how Iraq is going to end up today. They're moving away from us and building their alliances with people they have apparently more confidence in. Afghanistan is at least as troubling, and I don't advocate that we go back into Iraq, neither do I advocate that we accelerate our operations in Afghanistan. But there's no clear agenda being laid out. There's no foreign policy out there that people can put their fingers on. I'm planning on going back and engaging into another 4-day conference with the Aspen Institute on unraveling Iraq. I've got long, big ideas about that, but there's no reason to talk about them until after the election, and we're going to see what our commander-in-chief at that time thinks.
I would,
A depressing subject, though. It really
Yeah,
is.
it is. Yeah.
want to move back to the economy, but I want to disagree about the necessity of unraveling history to understand how to move forward. I think you can't ignore your history. So I do think you have to, quote, unravel it a bit.
I won't disagree with that. I just from a public, as a public official, I have to be concerned about what I say publicly to unravel.
But,
So
yeah,
you're
and
right
I
on your point.
understand that, but as a person.
But over
engaged in
coffee,
that
I'd
for a
go way
while,
into that
yeah,
with you.
Yeah, just love to take the Roman Republic as the standard. Okay, so. But Erskine Bowles came and spoke on campus, and he spoke to a large group of people, about 700, I would say, about his role in the Simpson-Bowles budget issues. So can you address where you would differ from him on the S&B approach to balancing the budget and getting the deficit under control?
Well, what I know about Simpson Bowles is it includes cuts and tax increases, and I think that's the thrust of the argument. Here's where we might differ. First of all, I don't know if he's examined my policy, but where we would differ is this, that I've looked back to unravel history a little bit, go back to George H.W. Bush, and there was a similar proposal that arrived in front of him. And he had said, read my lips, no new taxes. And he accepted tax increases as part of a spending cuts package. He got the tax increases, not the spending cuts, and lost his election, but he didn't keep his word. And so I would say that one should look at this is that taxes being too low is not our problem. Too much spending is our problem, but lack of having the will in Congress and on the part of the president, and this president and the previous president, to tighten our belt is the problem. If you've got a major problem, you should address that major problem, and if you can make progress on getting there on the spending cuts that we need and the long-term agenda, that last link in the chain can be the revenue stream. But I don't want to talk about a tax increase within the context of our recovery, because if it gets linked to the same kind of situation we've seen in the past, we'll get the tax increase, we won't get the spending cuts, because tax increases are easier. Spending cuts are hard. So I think we have to address the spending, focus on the spending, and if we can come to an agreement on that, if the last link in the chain is revenue, let's talk about that. But I think growth is more important than a revenue increase from a tax increase.
Okay, so,
And by the way, most economists believe that we'll go into recession if the Bush tax brackets are not extended beyond December 31st.
and I've heard that. So the military piece in here is one of our higher level of spending. So there's no chance, I mean, when you're gonna say that we defeat those forces that are against us in a global society, and looking at a place like Yemen, where that could be the hotbed of where this is all coming from. We aren't even in Yemen in terms of the military. We're there in presence, but we don't have any military action going on. I mean, what's to say that's not going to move to some island off of Australia? I mean, how are you going to defeat them without really going after them in a military fashion? And then, again, from my personal standpoint, I'm always struggling with who made us the person that has to, the country that has to do that. Who made us that country?
Well, I suppose we could unravel history and go back to that.
Yeah, I mean,
But
really.
I'm sure we ran out of time before I got all of that done.
Is there an element of arrogance in there or not? I don't know.
You can always make that charge, but facts are facts. And
I mean, if you're gonna try and cut the spending, let's talk about how you're gonna cut the military budget when it's taken up such a huge chunk, and then you need to, just.
I think there's waste in the Pentagon, and we have too many civilian employees tied with our military. There's efficiencies to find there. Our readiness and sacrificing our readiness should not be the first thing on the chopping block, but streamlining and finding the efficiencies within it. And the people inside the Pentagon tell me that. I think we can go there and find those kind of savings. I think we can find savings in the civilian side of this thing too that are substantial. But
Are you looking at contractors as part of that civilian side? Is that what you mean?
well, yes, contractors of all kinds, service contracts, and I have a good friend who was the head of Army procurement, and through the provisional authority early on in Iraq and we meet. I suppose now it comes down to 2-3 times a year, but he's lived in the middle of that environment, and he gives me a sense of what's available there. We just don't have the groundwork laid politically to get that done at this point, but we're moving in that direction, and I think that there are people there that do know it well enough to make those cuts in such a way that it doesn't cost us readiness. But I don't want to sacrifice military readiness. We are the unchallenged nation in the world. I mean, it is the fact, regardless of what. There's a difference in attitude between every American, but this nation finds itself in a situation where we didn't want to be the police power for the world, and George Bush said that he's not into nation building, but a few months later he found himself in nation building. And whether that was the right decision or not going into Iraq, it was a reality of what happened. Today, I'm watching this boil over in dozens of Middle Eastern cities across that part of the world, and it looks to me like that part of the world is lining up against us in a way that's unprecedented, at least in our modern period of time. How you address that is not to go in and kill people and make them hate us more. But there are friends that can be supported in there. I think that the British made a lot of mistakes when they drew lines on the map and didn't pay attention to the people that live within them, and we're still paying the price for that. The world's paying the price for that. I think at least hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, have been killed as a result of wars brought about because the people that were inside those borders were not compatible with each other, and the power struggle is going on. I believe that I'll just make this prediction. If we pull out of Afghanistan in 2014, and that is the plan, and that's the inertia, and I have sat in on those planning meetings, and I will tell you that NATO and the European Union and the Afghans and the Pakistanis and others that weren't in the room are not planning for what it is that Afghanistan, especially accepting Afghanistan's, the Afghans, the balance of them are not planning for what good things might be left in Afghanistan. They're planning on how to get out. When that happens, I believe that there will be a civil war in Afghanistan. And how that emerges is that it's going to cost another lot of lives, and it won't be very much American blood, if any, and I pray it's not. But there's that part of the world from Pakistan, Afghanistan, all the way across the Middle East could blow up on us. And we need to be building relationships with the people that are our friends in that part of the world, and that goes down more the line of tribal lines than it does nation lines. But that's just a little prophetic statement there. There's a lot more to that, but I don't want to go there.
So you would favor staying in Afghanistan beyond 2014?
Not under these conditions, with the inertia to pull out now, to reverse that inertia. I don't. Not given what we're looking at for a map today and the configuration of what's there today. But I would be talking, and I have over the last several years had several meetings with the Northern Alliance and their leaders. I know them, I count them friends, and there's an awful lot to consider before I say more about this, but it's going to be up to the Commander-in-Chief and his foreign policy. So we'll have to see. John Bolton has become a good friend over the years too, and he's somebody I look to for advice.
Yeah, I just have to
Jump right in.
I want to be too absurd.
Be provocative.
This really isn't a gotcha question. I'm serious. Because it's something I don't understand. I get the idea of the difference between Republicans and Democrats as they present themselves, and the idea of a Republican is someone who wants less government intrusion, more private responsibility, private enterprise. Reagan saying the government is not the solution, it's the problem. Democrats wanting more programs. Okay, so I get all that.
The Republicans more personal freedom.
And more personal freedom. So then, can you explain to me why Republicans are saying all of this with more personal freedom, and then to me they seem more intrusive in our personal lives than Democrats, for women being in our bodies in the most egregious way. I can't believe women, were fighting these same things that we fought in the 50s. And end-of-life issues, and talking about death panels, and going to Terry Schiavo's bedside when she's dying, and that's a family private matter. And I have a handicapped child. I had a handicapped child who passed away. And there was all of these government, I felt intrusions about the decisions that I was making about his life as a parent. And I have a lesbian niece whose wedding I just went to. That was a joyous occasion, but again, a government intrusion saying, oh, she can't marry. Well, in fact, she could. So life, death, sex, these are my body. These are all real personal matters, and it seems like it shouldn't be a Republican thing, and yet they say, government, no, too intrusive, and in all of those places, the Republicans, conservative Republicans, seem to me to be intrusive. So can you explain to me that kind of disconnect?
Okay. Well, first on the issue of death, I don't know how Republicans would be intrusive on that.
The senator's going to Terry Schiavo's hospital room. Remember that Terry Schiavo, that end-of-life case when she was on life support?
Well, I'd ask you then, since you brought that up, and I haven't heard her name in several years, but since you brought that up, I'd ask you to think about that in these terms, that she wasn't able to speak for herself. There was only one judge that ruled on this, and the advocate, and before the judge that advocated for that was her husband. And whatever you think about his decision or motives, when she couldn't speak for herself, but her husband was the only one that could, and there was only a judge that could only listen to her husband, a murderer on death row has far more opportunities to be saved by the system, because they are protected by cruel and inhuman punishment provisions within the Constitution.
Well, my
So
son
this
wasn't
is-
able to speak for himself either, and so I spoke as his mother. But I had to fight a lot of government intrusion with
Okay, so-
baby doe regulations, and doctors who would not listen to, who were nervous that they were gonna get sued because of government
Well,
regulations.
Then I understand this is very, very personal to you.
Yeah, it is.
And it's probably not one we should talk about
Okay,
here
well,
because of
okay,
that.
so
but-
go to the,
But
marriage.
I make the point that
You know,
I
all that
believe that a person should have an opportunity to be defended, that every life is sacred, and that if they can't speak for themselves, someone needs to speak on their behalf.
Okay, but the bigger picture of love, I mean, love,
That's the
death,
euthanasia
sex,
piece of it.
euthanasia.
The marriage piece of it you brought up,
Yeah,
and the marriage piece is this. Let's see, I made the statement in Orange City, in the heart of the social conservative center of Iowa, maybe America for that matter, that if the people of Iowa spoke and changed the marriage law in Iowa, which I helped to write, by the way, that's a decision that I would be willing to accept as the voice of Iowans, but not a decision made by judges that wrote in their opinion that they had found rights in the Constitution that were up to this point unimagined. That's appalling to me, to think that a judge could tell us that he found something in the Constitution that nobody knew was there, that they have discovered it, and somehow our contractual guarantee that was ratified by our predecessors the aspects of it were not considered by anyone until they decided they wanted to do that. That is a very definition of activism, and I put my focus on that, focused on the constitutional component of this, and I serve in the Constitution Subcommittee of the House Judiciary, and I've defended our Constitution with what I say is my kid's inheritance. So that piece, I accept the voice of the people. Here's another example. When Tom Vilsack signed Executive Order Number 7, and remember he and I have known each other for some time. I was in the state Senate and he was just a fresh governor. When he issued that executive order that gave protected status for sexual orientation and gender identity, I drew the line and said he cannot legislate by executive order. I made the argument on the Constitution. I took him to court and succeeded in that. And now for 10 years, the language that was in Section 19B.2 of the Civil Rights section of the Iowa Code was sustained by the decision that came down in King versus Vilsack on my half. Then, when Chet Culver became governor, they passed the legislation that I believe was verbatim to the executive order that was signed by Tom Vilsack. You can go back and look through all the records. You never heard a word from me on that. Because that was the voice of Iowans, duly passed through the legislature in a properly constitutional fashion. And so I have defended this Constitution consistently and long, and I'll keep doing that. And I think sometimes we need to do it even, and I'm not going to be able to give you an example of this in my case, but even if we agree with the policy, we need to be able to disagree with the method if it's an unconstitutional move.
I need to follow up. So you would...
You have more you want to say? Go ahead.
So the people of Iowa spoke and approved same-sex marriage, essentially. And that's fine. So
Well,
why that was part of the article, the editorial in this morning's paper, the
Really?
Register, about this. So, what is it that all of a sudden after 3 other legislatures this became a court case? Because somebody decided that they didn't like that, and so if the people speak, then the people don't speak? Is that what I'm hearing?
I guess I'm having trouble following that, on whether we're talking about the executive order or we're talking about marriage. But on the executive order, it was 10 years from the time that I won the court case against Tom Vilsack until the legislature acted.
Right.
Now, there's several things you can think. You can think they weren't paying attention. You could think that the society has shifted. You might think society could shift back and reverse it. But whenever there's a change like that, that needs to be an act of the Article I empowered legislature, not the decision made by a judge. And it's the case in both of these cases. So when it comes to the marriage issue, if the legislature changed the language, then that's the voice of the people. If a judge declares they found rights in the Constitution that were up to this point unimagined, that's their own violation of our Constitution, and we need to bring them to account on that as the people of the state of Iowa.
But that really wasn't the argument that they used in Varnum.
Well, I read it.
I
I quoted it verbatim, but
I read it too, and the gist of their argument was not that they found rights, but that the Equal Protection Clause rendered this law unconstitutional. That's the job of the judiciary, is to review legislation and make sure that it is constitutional. And it was their applying the Equal Protection Clause, they declared it unconstitutional.
it was the most contorted decision that I ever remember reading. And I know they referenced the language of the language in the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. It's the Iowa version of that, and I think you recognize that. But it was a contorted rationale. And so you can always come up with a contorted rationale. But I disagree with constitutional principles, and I've made that clear, and my arguments have been on constitutional principles. And I take an oath to uphold the Constitution, too. In fact, I've probably taken it more time than those judges have. And I take it seriously. And I have to take an oath to uphold the Constitution as means what it says and what it was understood to mean at its time of ratification. That's my oath. And I don't think that because a new General Assembly passes away and goes on to the next one, I'm not relieved of that oath. That's a lifetime oath. And I put my personal savings into that to defend it more than once. And I think that's my duty to Iowans. You know, if we disagree, we disagree. But I'm going to defend this Constitution. I take an oath to it. And I don't know how anybody can take an oath to a Constitution that they would allege is moving and changing and growing. It's meaningless at that point. Any judge that believes this Constitution is changing with evolving standards, then they've said to us, well, this Constitution is just a shield to protect them from public criticism because only they have the elite means of determining how it's changed, or it's become an artifact of history. One of the two, if you have an activist judge approach to this thing. That's why they provide a means to amend the Constitution, is so that we can make those changes as a voice of the people. It's a contractual guarantee.
One more time. I know we always want politicians to be really specific, and you were specific, but you didn't really answer my question in being general, which is the general view of conservatives and Republicans is get the government, out of my life, out of my hospital room, out of my bedroom, leave me alone, individual freedom. And I don't see how that is reconciled with the conservative social agendas of Republicans today.
Pick a topic within your general question then, and I'll answer it.
Well, no,
Well,
I wanted.
I have one.
Okay. That seems so intrusive.
Well, on your website, under your category Faith and Family Values, you state you believe that a mother requesting an abortion should undergo an ultrasound and review the life within her. And I think that's an example of what Fern's talking about government entering into the doctor-patient relationship.
Entering into a person's vagina is really it.
Well, he didn't say what method. But how do you explain that with your commitment to personal
I've never been through one
freedoms?
quite like this before.
It's fun.
Never got quite that personal, so.
Welcome to Ames.
How do you reconcile that? Seriously, how do you reconcile that level of intrusion to where the government is going to tell me and my doctor what
Legal
procedures
procedure.
I have to undergo?
I can answer that question, and especially I'd be willing to do so if I could ever hear from the other side of this argument at what moment life begins. And is human life sacred in all of its forms, or is it not?
That's
my
not the
profound-
question. That's beside
That's
the
my
point.
profound belief, and that informs the answer to the question that you've asked.
Okay.
And so I remember President Obama saying, and this is D.C. It was August 9th, 2008. And he was asked at the Saddleback Church by Pastor Warren, I believe his name was, that, you know, when did your life begin? And he said, that's above my pay scale. Well, a few months later, he became president, and he issued an executive order that accelerated the number of abortions in this country, and apparently it was no longer above his pay scale. I have a profound belief that human life is sacred in all of its forms, and I have spent a lot of my life working to protect those lives. And I have to pick a moment that life begins. It can't be along a continuum. It can't be somebody's definition of what viability is. It's a moment that life begins. I believe profoundly that there's only one moment, and that's the moment of conception. And so if you believe that, as I do, and you understand that full knowledge is instructive to helping save these lives, that supporting a 4D ultrasound as a means of informing the mother is a constructive thing to do, and in the end, 70% of them will decide to keep the baby. Now, why would you not want to make that available to someone?
Where's that statistic?
Okay, let me take another piece of this.
So, Mr. King.
I want to finish this. My opponent said that she thinks it's ridiculous to talk about sex-selected abortions. And we're having little baby girls being aborted in this country because they're little girls. Now, that doesn't disturb anybody here but me. That disturbs me a lot.
Where are those assertions coming from?
There's no fight with it. I know I taught English at the university, many people wrote papers on this. There's no, we can't agree with this part, but we can agree that right now, abortion is illegal in this country. Personally, I'm going to be 66 years old. I'm very glad that it is. I know women when I was young who died from illegal abortions. We don't agree on that, but we do agree that right now abortion is legal. So the idea that we can harass these women who are doing something that is legal in our country, I mean, you can work to then get abortion illegal again. I hope that you don't, because women will always be having abortions. We can't agree on when life begins. We don't agree on that.
You don't take a position on when life begins, I do.
Life begins when the children leave home.
That's my point. And that really is my point.
No.
It's an evasion of a moral
I think it's a
standard here.
very, very difficult decision. Look, I don't want to harass with my personal stuff, but I had a child who has had one of the most debilitating, horrible diseases that you can imagine. I worked very hard in giving scientific research so an amniocentesis could be discovered for his disability. When he died, he was blind and deaf, and it was a terrible disease. The idea that my daughter could choose not to have a child with that disease is really important to me. So you're right, I come from a very personal place. But that is not the issue here. Abortion is legal in our country, and my bigger question was, why are the Republicans in every issue, school lunches and death and sex, and I have to say, I read your website too, and I thought one of the funniest things was, I just read it to my husband before he came, was that you said that Viagra was a recreational drug.
I don't think that's what it says. I think it says, I don't think so. I think it says there's two reasons for sex, procreation and recreation, and the federal government shouldn't subsidize either one. That's what should be on their website. If it's not, change it, because it needs to be.
I agree with you, that was, it was a good soundbite, but anyway,
Well,
but the bigger issue again is the invasion of conservatives in our private lives with things that are already legal in this country. And I don't think you adequately reconcile the disconnect between stay out of your life, government, stay out of your life, don't don't go into the children's lunchroom, and
But I think there's also
the government's
kind
in
of
the
a
children's
debate on
lunchroom. The
that.
parents need to get involved to get the government out of rationing food to kids. And now the USDA is trying to get it into our kitchens on top of it. This nanny state's reached too far. We're just going to completely disagree on that.
No,
but
we
I want
agree
people to
the
have their
nanny
own freedom, and
state
I want
has reached too
parents to be able to
far.
raise their children. They're the ones that need to be in our jurisdiction, not the government intervening themselves. So
There's a government
Can I go on to something else here?
Yeah,
We're
sure.
sort of kind of getting off the rails here, it seems like.
Yes,
with
there's
this
a couple things that I
topic,
want
but,
to get to before we
Do
run
you
out
want
of
to go
time.
first, or do you want me to go first?
Well, it depends on where you're going.
I have to defer to the boss. sometimes,
Okay,
but
well,
I wanted.
I wanted to talk about healthcare.
Okay. Okay, I wanted to talk about the Second Amendment. The comment that you made during the debate in Orange City, which I think you saw me there. The comment that you made was that, this is something I hadn't heard expressed by you or other conservatives before, that the reason for the Second Amendment is not to protect hunting rights or self-defense or the kind of the traditional things that the NRA talks about. But it was, and I wrote this quote down before we came in here, to guard against tyranny because our founding fathers understood that if we do not have an armed populace, an armed tyrant could take over America. That may have been applicable in 1787. Is that really a serious possibility now in 2012 that somebody, our line of defense against an armed tyrant is somebody having a shotgun out in their barn? Or?
Mike, I think I don't remember for sure because I do a lot of different venues, but in some venues, and I don't know if I did in this one, I would go on to say, we don't have that threat now because we have an armed populace. And we don't have to worry about that because we have an armed populace. But that was put in place by our founding fathers. I believe that it does provide a deterrent. I don't think there's anything on the horizon that's a threat of this, and one of the reasons it's not on the horizon is because we have an armed populace. But I made the point that too often when defenders of the Second Amendment think of it as, well, okay, we've got a constitutional right to hunt and to do target and do self-defense. Well, we do. But all of our constitutional rights, and sitting here in this newspaper, I want to emphasize this, First Amendment rights included speech, religion, the press, and assembly, and Second Amendment rights, and on up them down the line. If we stop exercising those rights, they will be defined away from us. If we stopped assembling, for example, at some point someone would say, well, you have to have a permit, you can't do so, and you point to the Constitution, they say, nobody's used that for a generation or two, you're not going to be able to assemble, it doesn't mean the same thing it meant back then. Same with freedom of speech, same with freedom of the press. So I'm telling people that raise your children with gun safety, with respect for them, but understand also that exercising Second Amendment rights in hunting and target and in self-defense in a responsible, safe way is a constructive way to defend our Second Amendment because it gets imbued and stays within our culture and civilization.
Right. I guess I wasn't arguing about whether the Second Amendment's good or bad or indifferent. I'm just saying that the statement you made about the armed populace being the deterrent, I mean, we have an army, we have a CIA, we have an FBI, we have a police force, we have a National Guard. I mean, we have a lot of other more institutional protections against an armed tyrant coming against us. And it seems like,